It always surprises my Greek students when I show them that the Holy Spirit in the New Testament is actually not a he. In fact, when you look at the whole Bible, the Holy Spirit or God's Spirit is usually an it or a she. Now, if it surprised you that the Holy Spirit is an it or a she, you wouldn't be alone. Most of the time when you're reading the English Bible, whenever there's a pronoun used for the Holy Spirit, it's going to be he. Let's look at Romans 8:26, for example. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. In many translations, when translators need a pronoun for the Holy Spirit, the translators use the pronoun he, or in this instance, himself. Now, if I'm honest, the logic here makes sense, right? God the Father is often referred to as a he throughout the Bible. Jesus the Son uses he pronouns. And the Holy Spirit, it only makes sense, right? The Holy Spirit would also have he pronouns. However, when you start looking at the original languages, you find out something different. Greek nouns have three possible genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And when Greek speakers and writers use pronouns to reference those nouns, the pronouns match the gender of the word it is referencing. Masculine words get the he pronoun, feminine words get the she pronoun, and neuter words get the it pronoun. The grammatical gender of the Spirit in the New Testament is actually neuter, and therefore the Spirit uses it pronouns. So in Romans 8:26, it should actually read like this: in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit itself intercedes for us through wordless groans. So in the New Testament, the Spirit is grammatically an it, not a he. Now when I show people this in Greek, they often respond by pointing to John 14:26. It says, "But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things, and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you." So most interpreters will see this he and think it's talking about the Holy Spirit. However, this pronoun isn't a he either. Although this is a masculine pronoun, it's actually a demonstrative pronoun, a kainos, not a personal pronoun. So it's more commonly translated that one or that person, not necessarily he. Yeah, that's definitely what it says. Additionally, this pronoun does not actually point back to the Spirit, but the word translated helper, parakletos. Helper is a masculine word, and therefore it uses masculine pronouns. Dr. Daniel Wallace actually has written quite a bit on this topic, and he explains, the gender of a kainos has nothing to do with the natural gender of pneuma. The antecedent of a kainos in each case is parakletos, not pneuma. So the demonstrative pronoun is grammatically related to helper, and the Spirit is not a he in John's Gospel either. And so the Holy Spirit remains an it in the New Testament. Now for most English speakers, it seems like a very impersonal pronoun. And a lot of times people think that calling the Holy Spirit an it robs the Holy Spirit of personhood and makes the Holy Spirit not personal. But calling the Spirit an it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not personal or it's not a person in the Trinity. It just means that that's the way the New Testament authors chose to talk about the Spirit. Furthermore, there are many neuter words in Greek that describe people. One great example being the words for child, teknon and paidon. These words are neuter and they even use neuter pronouns. For example, Ephesians 6:4. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So neuter pronouns can be personal, and calling the Spirit an it is not impersonal. Therefore, using the it pronoun to refer to the Holy Spirit was grammatically normal and correct in Greek. And I feel like if it was good enough for New Testament authors, it should be good enough for me too. However, if you still feel weird about calling the Holy Spirit an it, fear not, for something different happens in the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, nouns can either be feminine or masculine. Spirit is a feminine noun and is often the subject of third feminine singular verbs. Therefore, in Dr. Will Gafney's book, Womanist, Midrash, she challenges interpreters to read the Hebrew Bible very closely. For when you do, it reveals that God's Spirit is often presented as a she. One of the more interesting passages is the opening of Genesis. Here is how it's typically translated. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. However, in Hebrew, God's Spirit is feminine, and the action that follows is a feminine participle. Listen to what Dr. Gafney says about this passage.
So Womanist Midrash starts with the biblical text in biblical Hebrew, and the first layer is really translation. And there's a part of that that is almost literal, if you will. And so in Genesis 1, God is introduced, Bereshit bara Elohim, when beginning, He, God, created. The noun has a plural form that is inclusive, but also masculine plural, but the verb is masculine singular. But in the second verse, the Ruach Elohim, Merachefet al Panei Hamayim, and the Spirit of God, she hovered or fluttered over the face of the waters. The verb is feminine, the noun is feminine. And so that is the sort of plain face of the text. My translation reflects that He, God, created, and the Spirit, she was hovering.
Dr. Gafney's close reading of the Hebrew in Genesis 1 reveals that at the beginning of God's story, both masculine and feminine language was used to describe God. This is actually incredibly fitting because later in Genesis 1:27, God creates humanity in God's image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Just as at the beginning of Genesis, God is described with a masculine action and a feminine action, so too, when God creates an image of God's self, God creates a male and a female. Man alone does not represent God, and nor does woman alone represent God, but both represent God together. So, the Spirit of God acts with feminine verbs all over the Hebrew scriptures, because this is the grammatically correct way of speaking about God's Spirit in Hebrew. However, there are a few exceptions where this rule is broken, and God's Spirit uses third masculine singular verbs. Regardless, these are the exceptions to the rule. When God's Spirit is discussed in the Bible, the Spirit overwhelmingly uses third feminine verbs in Hebrew and neuter pronouns in Greek. In other words, it's far more common for the Spirit to be considered an it or a she rather than a he. Now you may be wondering, why does it matter? Why does it matter that we represent the grammatical gender of the Holy Spirit in Greek, in Hebrew, and English Bibles? In fact, some Bible scholars will even say don't overemphasize the grammatical gender of these words. This is just metaphorical speak. It doesn't really represent reality. In fact, Daniel Wallace says, this does not mean that in the New Testament the Spirit is a thing, any more than in the Old Testament the Spirit, ruach, a feminine noun, is a female. Grammatical gender is just that, grammatical. The conventions of language do not necessarily correspond to reality. However, this is not true with what we know about language, interpretation, or hermeneutics, and the human brain. Cognitive linguists and philosophers George Lakoff and Mark Johnson explain in their book Metaphors We Live By that metaphors and structures of language are always grounded in lived human experience, and those linguistic structures impact how we think and operate in the world. They write, syntax is not independent of meaning, especially metaphorical aspects of meaning. The logic of language is based on coherence between the spatialized forms of language and the conceptual system. These spatialized forms and conceptual systems that Lakoff and Johnson are referencing are all grounded in lived human experience. This is why Lakoff says in his more popular level book, The Political Mind, metaphor is not just a matter of words. We think metaphorically. They are not mere metaphors, not extraneous. They are neither arbitrary nor disposable. They tell us what the heart of morality is. Therefore, the metaphors we use determine a great deal about how we live our lives. So even if this gendered language or neuter language for God's Spirit is just grammatical, just a mere metaphor, just text on a page, it's important to recognize that language shapes how we operate and think in the world. And so if we only allow God's Spirit to be spoken of in male terms, we not only misrepresent the biblical text, but we limit our own cognitive potential. We limit our conceptions about God, and we even limit our way of acting and operating in the world. And so I would encourage you, let the language of the Bible impact your thoughts, your words, in your speech. If the biblical authors are willing to call the Holy Spirit a she, a he, and an it, then maybe you should too. If you want to dive into more geeky things about the Bible, check out this video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, peace.